Rosie and Colette. If you see them on the video, you should be able to pin that video to the screen if you want to keep seeing it. Another quick reminder that this session is being recorded, and I think we're also being live streamed on Facebook. The recording is going to be available to watch after we finish, so if you've got colleagues who weren't able to join, feel free to share the link later. And finally, if you're using social media and you want to post about the webinar, we've got hashtag inclusive beginnings. If you could use that, that would be great. So I'll start with a really quick recap of what EENET is for anybody who's joining us who's not familiar with EENET. So for the last 23 years, EENET, Enabling Education Network, has been supporting education stakeholders around the world to document and share and critically reflect on experiences of making education more inclusive. So you might have seen already our extensive website, our annual publication, the Enabling Education Review, and various other publications and projects. And then in the last 10 years or so, we've also been providing consultancy services to a wide range of different organisations. We're holding this webinar today to help us celebrate the launch of our latest video-based training resource, which we've called Inclusive Beginnings. And you're going to hear and see a little bit more about that later. So before we get started, I'll just quickly run through the agenda for today. We've got short presentations on the importance of properly financing inclusive early childhood development and education, and that's from Nafisa Babu in Light for the World. Then we're going to hear a bit about the background to EENET's Inclusive Early Childhood and Development and Education video project from Duncan Little. We'll show you a short promotional video that introduces these two films in the Inclusive Beginnings package. And then Karen Kayat will share some reflections on what makes early childhood development and education inclusive and appropriate. And our final presenter is Dragana Sretanov from OSF, and OSF funded the EENET's video project. And Dragana will share some thoughts on the importance of inclusive early childhood development and education and building the capacity of early years educators. And then once we've heard all the presentations, we'll have the Q&A session with all the presenters so that you can ask questions. So our first presenter is Nafisa. Are you ready, Nafisa? And can we get Nafisa's slides?
Hi, Ingrid. Yes, I am.
Excellent. I'll just give you a little introduction then. So Nafisa is Director of Inclusive Education at Light for the World. She's a qualified speech language therapist and audiologist with a master's in inclusive education. Her areas of focus include research, advising on inclusive education policies and practices, advocacy work and training teachers, education officials and communities on inclusive education. And Nafisa has 12 years of experience working in the most complex communities and countries to foster a more inclusive society. So over to you, Nafisa. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid. So I'm really happy that we are having this conversation around inclusive early childhood development, because I know firsthand the life transformative effects of good early childhood development and a good nurturing care. But it saddens me immensely when I go to some of our countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where I meet girls and boys whose life could have been significantly different if they'd received good early childhood intervention. You know, my brother, who was born with Pierre-Robin syndrome, he's got a good life now. And I think it's partly because, or mostly because, my mother dedicated a lot of the early years to support him, stimulate him, and get all of us involved. And I think now, being a mother of a 4-year-old, I even understand and I'm more critically aware of the effects that I have on my daughter and the responsibility I have on developing her to the fullest, and also quite mindful now during this COVID pandemic about the influence of the stress that I experience on her development. So the research I'm going to be presenting today makes the case for increasing investment in early childhood development services for the most vulnerable of children. And these challenges are, and multiple disadvantages has become more pronounced now because of the COVID pandemic. And even though the research on this report was completed earlier, the fundamental message still rings true that we need urgent investment in inclusive ECD and it is the most effective way to reach the furthest behind. And I think that we should hear it even more now. Next slide. So you may know that 43% of the world's children, that's every second child in low and middle income countries, are at risk of not reaching their fullest potential. And the figures are expected to increase due to the effects of the pandemic. And children in, children in even in the poorest countries are most disadvantaged. We did a research to look into some of the current funding levels in early childhood development by some of the most influential donors globally. And one of the key findings that we found out that is only the cumulative investment in early childhood development is only around 4%, which is really shockingly low. And countries such as Germany and others and France were investing around 1%. And most of these countries, when we looked at what were their policies were saying, only the World Bank and UNICEF really had an integrated approach that looked across sectors and held in the center the inclusion of the most vulnerable children. Next slide. I think there's a problem with the slides. The order is a bit wrong. So I think, but not a problem. So, you know, this is what we also discovered in doing the study, that there was no real good way of tracking early childhood development investments. And there was often a problem in the coding system in the OECD DAC database where that basically stores all the information around funds that are invested in developing countries by donor countries. And this is particularly important if we say that inclusive ECD is so critical to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and for building up human capital. It's really important that we know and track the investments required, because the Lancet series and others have proven that it is the wisest and most effective way to lift people or lift children up and out of poverty, and it's the best investment in achieving children's full potential. Every dollar investment has a return of about $15, and this was proven by the Lancet series a few years ago. Next slide. So investing in early childhood development is not really expensive. It will only cost an additional 50 cents investment in different sectors to be able to achieve inclusive early childhood development. And I think that it's also, as we know, there are immense returns on investment. Can you change the slide? So these are just the countries that were under study, and the reason we chose some of these countries was because they are one of the biggest donors to early child development, but also they are also particularly influential in changing and influencing the sector. What our study did was we also zoned into four recipient countries: Zambia, Zimbabwe, Burkina Faso, and Mozambique, to get a picture of what's actually happening on the ground, how are funds used. And these countries are also a good example of countries that are a good example of, gives us a good picture of what's happening globally and of countries where we want to scale up early childhood development services. Next slide. So what ranked true for us was that the key findings in our overall research was that early childhood development is massively underfunded, and even though there are verbal commitments to it and overwhelming evidence of its transformative powers, we don't really see evidence that the commitments and the talk doesn't really match the funding levels. Vulnerable children, particularly children at risk of developmental delays and disabilities, are not necessarily considered from the outset when they're developing programs. And investment levels are nowhere near ensuring that we have integrated, that means across sectors, inclusive early childhood development for all children, and ensuring that children just don't just survive, but actually thrive. Next slide. Yes, this is the slide that was shown earlier about the investment levels, showing how shockingly low they actually are. We can go to the next slide. What we also did was then, that was early child development overall. Then we also looked at early childhood, what was the investment in early education. That's ECD, or pre-primary education. And this is a subsector of early childhood development, The disbursement in this sector was alarmingly low, considering that it is actually a specific target in our Sustainable Development Goals target 4.2, and that we are 10 years away so this is the goal of 2030 of achieving it. And also considering that the benchmark now known globally is 10% point of education investment should be going to pre-primary education. So UNICEF, which is primary mandate is children, only invests 88.7% of their aid to pre-primary, and the GP only 5%. All other donors were coming in around 1%, and the EU was at even less than 1%, and the UK were around 0.43%. So this is really shocking, and it's something that really needs to be changed and stepped up in the coming years. We also see that emerging commitments on disability inclusion are coming up with the World Bank that's made a 10-year commitment on, that's made a commitment to ensure by 2025 that all its education programs are disability inclusive, as well as the UK government and USA that has now released its policy on children in adversity. We also see that Finland has been a great shining example in taking a rights-based approach and putting children who are disadvantaged at the forefront of their funding. So that's been a really great example overall. In our recipient countries, I think this shows the need even is even more pronounced. The next slide. In the health sector seems to be the main sector that investments are happening in all 4 of the countries. And there's also what we also found was there was quite a big misunderstanding of what ECD actually is. The idea of the nurturing care framework and seeing it as a comprehensive package of support was not really evident. It was more seen as just pre-primary education. And understanding around early childhood intervention was also not quite there. For Mozambique and Burkina Faso, only 0.2% of aid was invested in pre-primary education. And this is quite, I mean, if you think of the correlation between the investment and also dropout, you can see that there's quite a strong link. And we also know that we need to quadruple the investment by donors and governments to reach that 44 million US dollar a year gap in achieving target 4.2, which is on pre-primary education. Next slide. So here are some of the 5 main recommendations that we have. It was invest more and focus on calculating the real funding gaps at country level. And that means working more closely with and understanding what are the gaps in developing the workforce required for early childhood development. The other key recommendation that came out was develop the importance of developing an agreed upon method to track ODA spending. Because if you isolate the spending on early child development, it's easier to be able to track if there's been an increase in investment over years. And we also need to encourage more donors to use the disability marker to track spending specifically on vulnerable groups. So the disability marker, there's also a marker for girls, and I think this should be done more deliberately. We also see it's important to increase investment in early childhood intervention programs. That's for children aged 0 to 6, because too often we find children too late. And we should also make sure that programs hardwire inclusion from the outset, so we can make sure that we leave no one behind. And we also need, I think this is very important, that we also need a more governments to prioritize and donor agencies to prioritize ECD and show leadership and champion that cause. Next slide. And in the recipient country level, we also found that, even though there were policies that were in draft, they were not necessarily coherent or inclusive and multi-sectoral. And often these policies were not funded well. And to overcome some of the complexities around providing a multi-sectoral approach and collaboration that early childhood development services require, we thought it's really important that we look at certain sectors taking the lead depending on the year, on the ages of children, and using pre-existing donor mechanisms and platforms, such as in education, we have a local education group that looks after education. There's also donor groups for health. We also thought it was important that governments show considerable more ambition around developing ECD services by increasing, and that ambition really comes from us as civil society also look at increasing awareness around the importance on early childhood development for parents and communities and other stakeholders, so they can push for better services. And at the recipient country level, I think donors also have to play a really important role. I mean, we often see that we have great policies on international level, but it doesn't necessarily trickle down to national level or the understanding of them. So we feel that it's really important to give more and support domestic financing by leveraging funds from other sources and looking at things like progressive taxation, and use ODA to build up ECD services to really harness equity and inclusion, and support the development of different cadres of early childhood development workers for a long term, because often these workers are either low paid women or volunteer, or these positions are voluntary or paid by the community, and this is not really a good way forward. We also need to build the capacity of policymakers so they can plan and implement ECD services more effectively, and that technical support is very much needed moving forward. So the next, we are therefore, one of the things that we feel is so important at the current moment, sorry, next slide, we are calling on all governments and donors to really prioritize the protection and support of young children and the key caregivers in the response and recovery to COVID-19, and we also need to maintain and boost our investments that support children's health, physical, cognitive, and social and emotional development, particularly the most vulnerable, by putting equity and inclusion front and center. And I think this is the only way we can really ensure that we leave no child behind. So we have a campaign going on, and this research is part of a compendium of tools which include donor profiles, a checklist, country reports, and we also have a very exciting campaign with Global Citizen, where we are asking on the heads of state to invest more and prioritize inclusive early childhood development. We can send through the link for that campaign to all of you, so it would be really fantastic if you can sign that petition, and we could see more movement in this area and make a big change in the youngest and most vulnerable in our society. Thank you, Ingrid.
Lovely, thanks very much, Nafisa. Just a quick reminder for anybody who's joined us a little bit later, make sure if you want the English that you go down to the bottom of your screen and click where it says interpretation and select English. And if you want Arabic, select the Korean option. I'm afraid there's no Arabic option, but we're running Arabic on the Korean channel. Also, just a quick reminder, if you've got any questions for Nafisa following her presentation, please type them in the Q&A box, and we'll be collating them, and we'll try and answer as many as possible towards the end of the webinar. Next, we're going to hear from Duncan. So if Duncan can get himself lined up, we've got Duncan's slides, yeah. So we're going to hear from Duncan Little. Duncan is one of EENET's directors. He's a qualified teacher with over 30 years of experience of teaching in primary and secondary schools in Africa and the UK, with a strong focus on supporting marginalised learners, including learners with disabilities, special educational needs, emotional and behavioural problems, and refugee and asylum seeking learners. Duncan has trained teachers and trainers on inclusive education for 20 years in countries across Europe, Africa and Asia. And he's produced various film projects capturing inclusive practice and stakeholders' voices. So, do we have you online, Duncan?
Yeah, I've opened my video and my unmuted. So,
great.
Hi everybody.
Excellent.
Okay, I don't know whether people want to see me first or not. I don't know. But anyway, yeah, as Ingrid was saying, I'm Duncan, and I'm really happy to see you all here today, and I just want to give you just a few minutes of background of the filming. As many of you may know, from 2016-17 we filmed in Burkina Faso with Light for the World, with OSF in Ukraine and Myanmar, supported by them, and also in UK. And we created a very successful set of films, 10 films, called An Inclusive Day. And as a result of that, among the comments coming back was inevitably that people had identified some gaps, which two of the main ones being ECD provision, and the second one being inclusive transition. So we decided to go ahead and create some more films. The two which you will see have been released today. And working again with OSF, we went back to Ukraine and filmed with our partner there, Step by Step Foundation, Ukrainian Step by Step Foundation, in right in the east of the country, right next to Russia, where there's separatist fighting going on at the moment. And then we moved from the east by train to Kiev via Kharkiv, and then on to the Polish border in Lviv. And we filmed throughout the country at various kindergartens and preschool provision. In Southern Africa, we worked with OSISA, which is the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa. And we looked at filming in Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Swaziland, settling on the Kingdom of Swaziland, now known as Eswatini, and worked with 4 different partners there: Bantwana Initiative, Vusam Not For, Church Forum, and Swansifa. Again, they're working with different ECD programs. A lot of them, as you'll see in the slides in a minute, are very, very small 1-room or 2-room buildings, which originally were neighborhood care points set up by UNICEF to feed families and their children, those especially suffering from HIV and AIDS. And so we set about filming. Firstly, I scoped in June and July in the countries, and then we went back. I was the producer, and I went with a camera person, Ollie or Joe. So the 2 of us made all the films, the rushes. And I think one thing to stress here is that this is like documentary style rushes. They are filmed as real life. There's no staging, nothing else. There's no actors or anything. We just go and film exactly what we see there at the time. We don't stage anything. I've got lots of notes from ECD advisors from EENET that says, can we capture this? Can we capture that? And we hope to capture these things. Sometimes we come back empty-handed because what people want to see is not happening on the ground, but we don't stage anything. This is all real life. Also, what we do is we were looking at the transitioning of children from school to ECD, ECD to primary, even primary to secondary, grade to grade. We were looking at that inclusive, successful transitioning. And so we filmed children who were about to depart for ECD, from ECD to primary, to go and look at their new primary school, which they would go to in the next 6 months or so, and to have a look round and orientation, and also to meet some of the older pupils from those primary and secondary schools, and to actually have them come into their ECD setting to actually work and play and talk with these young children who are going to be moving from ECD to primary, to actually give them a buddy which they will then get to know, and then they will see when they go to the new school the following academic year. So if we have some of the slides, I'll just talk you through a few of the slides. So if you show the slides. Okay, so this is Swaziland, very mountainous country. And here's one of the settings. You can see how small the NCP is, the neighborhood care point. And there's Ollie filming parents and children coming to school. On the right-hand side, there is the kitchen, which is set up by UNICEF to cook meals for parents in need and their children. Here we are in a second setting, which was on the Swazi-South African border, near, in the northeast, in Heli Heli. And again, you can see how small the structure is, right in the mountains, and this was some children going to school. Here's the third setting, a bit bigger. This one had like 4 rooms in it, and the children in the valley below Heli Heli, they were welcoming us. And you can see all the space around. A lot of the education, the learning, the play goes on outside. There's lots of work, play goes on outside the ECD setting. And this is inside the final place that we filmed. We filmed this right in the north west, in the Drakensberg Mountains, close to the South African border. And you see how small everything is. But even though the space is small, the children are all playing, they're learning together, they're using teaching and learning aids that are from the environment to count, etc. Finally, in Swaziland, this is one, we went and did 3 different school visits with ECD pupils moving to their primary setting. So here you will see the children from the Drakensberg Mountains. They've gone for the day to visit their new primary school. The teacher in green is their teacher from the ECD setting, and the teacher in grey is their new teacher, who they will see in January. So it shows how the primary schools and the ECD settings can actually work together, and the children get an orientation of where they will be going, etc., the following academic year. Now we move to Ukraine. This is one of a very familiar sight throughout the country, Soviet era kindergarten, preschool building. A lot of them are all the same throughout the country. Okay, and so you can see us filming here. So what we did was we filmed a family every place we went, every setting we went. We filmed a family with a child. It might be a child with a disability or special educational need or other additional need. It may be children that are orphaned, living with their grandparents, etc. So you can see the filmmaker Ollie on the right with Oleg, our interpreter, and on the left hand side you can see Nina and her son Ilya, who's riding his bicycle to school. So we filmed the whole school day, from getting up, moving into the school, the ECD setting, and then all the play and games they had during the day, and then coming back at the end of the day. So this is her walking through Kharkiv. Next slide. Okay, this is, we got to Lviv, and this again, this is now Jo, and she's filming children that were on an outdoor activity in the woods next to the preschool. And again, just like the similarities with Swaziland, there is so much outdoor learning going on in both Ukraine and in Swaziland. And as with Swaziland, here is a visit by the preschool, the kindergarten in Lviv, kindergarten number 37, going to the Lyceum, the primary and secondary school in Lviv. And here with the transition, and with them coming to meet the head teacher of their new school, with in the background Lesia, who is in the blonde, a woman with glasses. She is the ECD head teacher. So again, these two schools work together very closely. She brings the ECD learners that are about to move into their new school across, and there is this discussion going on with the head teacher and her new learners who will be with her next year. And if you remember at the start, I was talking about older learners coming to see younger learners in the ECD setting, getting to know them, playing with them, and talking to them, so that they have then buddies when they go to the next educational setting, so they can remain with those buddies. They could ask them questions, etc., because they've got to know the older learners. And quite often the older learners, it's a lot easier for younger learners to speak to older learners rather than to speak to adults. So the young voices that we hear on the films that you'll see, the transition film, are these older buddies that are assisting the younger buddies. Okay. And here they are, so they've been playing with them, so now they're all sitting down, all at the same level, the same. When we do action research training, or everybody sits at the same level, so everybody is talking to one another at the same level in Swaziland. And this is in Ukraine. So the older pupils that you saw, the Lyceum that the ECD learners were going to, they're playing. They came to the ECD setting and are playing with them. And also, while playing with them, they can also be asking questions and getting feedback, etc., from their younger peers. Okay, so big thank you to everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar.
Unmute myself. Lovely, thank you, Duncan. To everybody else, don't forget to pop over to the Q&A box and ask Duncan any questions that you have about the films, about the places we filmed, about how we do filming, anything you want to ask him. Now, before we go on to our next presentation, if Emma is ready, my colleague Emma McKinney is going to introduce our promotional video. And a quick reminder for those who are watching and listening in Arabic, Ayman's going to share a link with you so that you should be able to go over to our YouTube channel when we're watching the video and access subtitles in Arabic if you want to. We're not watching it quite yet, but when we get there, you should be able to do that, hopefully, if he's sending the link. Okay, so over to Emma. Do we have Emma?
Yes, hopefully
Yes.
you've got, yeah, lovely.
Got you.
Thanks so much, Ingrid. Okay, so before our next presentation, we're going to show you a short video, promotional film that introduces the two videos in our Inclusive Beginnings training pack. The training pack consists of 2 videos with 2 accompanying training manuals as well. Plus, there's also a short guidance document with some suggestions for using the videos for advocacy as well as for training purposes as well. This promotional video was compiled for us by a student with disabilities who's hoping to start university this year to train in filmmaking himself. So enjoy.
Inclusive Beginnings is a 2-part video-based training resource. It supports professional development for educators working in early childhood and primary settings in low and middle income contexts. Inclusive early childhood development and education enables all children to learn alongside their peers from a young age. The first film helps educators to find out more about working with colleagues to support inclusion for all learners, understanding and responding to each child's development and individual needs, working collaboratively with parents and caregivers, organising the learning environment and planning learning sessions, and using real-world objects to stimulate learning. Inclusive transition means that when learners move from home to their first education setting or to new classes or settings, it is a smooth process for them, their families, and the teachers. The second film helps educators think about supporting children's transition into their first education setting, and then ensuring transitions to subsequent levels of education are inclusive too. It also looks at the transitions that children experience within school every day, and highlights the importance of communicating with children about all these big and small educational transitions. Watch the videos on EENET's YouTube channel and download the training manuals from our website, www.eenet.org.uk. Hard copies are also available.
Wonderful. So I hope you enjoyed that little snapshots of our videos. So basically the 2 training videos on inclusive practice and inclusive transition are both available from today on EENET's YouTube channel, and the training manuals are also available on our website. We'll have printed copies of the manuals available to order from EENET's online shop very soon. And the documents are free, but you may need to pay for postage depending on where you're based. You'll also be able to order the videos on USB flash drive so that you don't have to rely on accessing them online. And the flash drives will contain these new ECDE videos and manuals, plus our previous set of training videos and manuals as well, which are called an Inclusive Day. My colleagues are probably sharing the details in the chat box right now, where you can find details about everything, but please keep your eye out on our website and our social media to find out more details as well. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Emma. I think we probably tested the internet a little bit there. It seemed to be a little bit slow running the video, but I think you got the gist of it. So next up with our presenters is Karen Kayat. Sorry, excuse me. Karen is an inclusive education consultant, and she's an experienced education program advisor with a background as an early years teacher, especially for learners with disabilities. Karen's got a doctorate in education and specialised in inclusive education. She's currently based in New Zealand, but she worked for many years in Afghanistan and Iraq, providing policy and teacher training technical assistance to governments. Karen's been a consultant for the last 7 years, including working with EENET. She's reviewing NGO education projects, developing project methodology and teacher training materials, and conducting literature reviews. So over to Karen, if we've got you.
Yep, here I am. So my task today is to offer a brief taster of some of the key messages covered in the videos and the accompanying training manuals. So inclusive early education, as with other levels of education, is really just quality education. These films and the manuals don't presume to cover every aspect of what quality inclusive early childhood settings and transitions should look like, but we offer some skills and ideas. So one of the central ideas touched on in both of the films is the importance of a distinction between practice suitable for early childhood settings and that which is more commonly associated with schools. So this is the difference between child-led play, teacher-directed instruction, or discovery and exploration learning compared with predetermined curriculum objectives. You might have seen early childhood settings using these school-like types of instruction, which are really meant for older children. It's been called schoolification, or turning early childhood settings into mini schools or formal settings. It might look something like planned paper and pencil tasks, repeating alphabet and numbers, letter of the week activities, colouring in activity sheets, or long adult directed group times. It might also be playful, fun games and activities, but where the educator is directing and expecting all children to be involved. Parents might be interested in this type of teaching for their child, and often it's even promoted as a way to give children a better chance for academic success in school. Sometimes it's suggested as a way to get children ready for school, or a way to make transition into school easier. But it turns out that for a number of reasons, this practice of introducing academic learning early to children in this way doesn't actually translate into the hoped for academic advantage. And even of more concern to us, particularly in the context of inclusion, is that these types of approaches don't promote diversity, and they're at odds with inclusive education. In terms of academic advantage, research supports the conclusion that starting school level academics early doesn't actually follow through to sustained academic advantage. Any positive impacts that have been found actually fade out during the first years of schooling. Early childhood development does prepare children for school, but not in the way that we might think. It's very well understood and widely studied how much a lasting impact early childhood experiences can have. The core skills which they learn through play and exploration are what they need to learn at this age. So, and they will help them to learn the other skills that they need later on. So these include social skills like cooperating, personal skills like managing emotions, physical skills like manipulating small objects, and many others. So these skills, we call them foundational because they're the foundational skills to the skills that they'll learn later on at school. But children who are too busy learning academic skills can be deprived of this age-appropriate learning and development that they are ready for in their early years. But even if these skills, or even with these skills, they're not best learned in a teacher-directed instruction type of way. Firstly, this is because children all have different diverse pathways of development. And secondly, because they're best learned as the child is interested and ready to learn them. So the developmentally appropriate way of learning at this age, we all know, is play, not teacher-directed instruction. So it follows that developing an enjoyment of learning is far more likely to happen in a context where children are making choices of what to play, who to play with, following their interests. So this love of learning and curiosity about the world is another essential foundation to lifelong successful learning. Imposed curriculum objectives at the early childhood age are at odds with inclusion. This is because they don't leave room for the diverse learning pathways that we expect and celebrate in inclusive education. It assumes that children learn in similar ways, similar rates, similar amounts, and it begins to paint children as capable or not capable. Next slide, please. So, inclusive early childhood settings should instead be centred around age-appropriate and child-appropriate practices. Research shows that this is the type of setting where there will be greater developmental benefits for children. Age-appropriate. Age-appropriate practices, first of all, recognise that all children at this age learn through play. Quite different from adult-directed activities, play is child-led. It shouldn't be misunderstood as just playful learning or fun activities which are still the educator's idea or planned and initiated by an adult. Play happens when the early childhood setting is prepared with a range of resources and spaces, and the child is free to make choices about what and who they engage with, how they use resources and space, and all of those other decisions along the way. Another misunderstanding which can slip into early childhood development and education is that it's just about leaving children to play and sitting back. On the contrary, the role of the educator and others in this space is really important. Educators would understand early childhood development and the developmental processes. With this understanding, they then observe the child, learn about their strengths, their interests and emerging skills. Quality early childhood settings will emphasise the role of these nurturing relationships in the learning and development for children. Adults can then join in children's play, interact with them, notice their efforts and achievements, and they can intentionally extend their play, add more knowledge, ideas, dimensions. When educators are preparing the resources and the settings, they can provoke children's interest with activities and resources, but of course in the context of play in an optional way. To be child appropriate, this is to recognise diversity, to value difference and support the learning and development of children as individuals. This can happen when adults are not busy with leading activities or directing large groups of children. Instead, they're free to observe children at play in small groups. They learn about their interests and their capabilities, and they engage with the families, parents, guardians, caregivers, and use all of this knowledge to offer individual support to children as they play and move through their own unique learning and development pathways. Last slide. I've got another slide there. So a lot is to be said about the long-term impact of quality, inclusive early childhood development and education. But we should also remember that early childhood years are not solely a preparation for later life or even for school. They're also about being and thriving in the present. So learning and development enhances their childhood that's lived now It enables young children to engage and enjoy everyday life, to know themselves, to build relationships with others, and face the challenges and joys in the here and now. So I'll leave you with that. That was one of the themes that is raised in the videos and explored further in the training manuals. These resources explore many more similar practical ideas which can support early childhood educators seeking to become more inclusive in their practice. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Karen. Again, if you have any more questions for Karen, do submit them in the Q&A, and we will try and cover as many as we can by the end of the day, the end of the session. Our final presenter today is Dragana Sretanov, who is a senior team manager in Early Childhood Programme of Open Society Foundations. Dragana has 25 years of experience in the international development and humanitarian spheres. Since 2012, she has led OSF's ECD, Early Childhood Development Inclusion work, and since 2014, she's led the multi-sectoral early childhood intervention work in Central and Eastern Europe. Before joining OSF, Dragana worked with Save the Children UK in advisory and managerial roles in the ECD and education teams, working with staff from over 45 country programmes. She's written and coordinated numerous articles, guidelines, external evaluations and policy research publications, and contributed to many different global advocacy and learning opportunities. So Dragana, over to you if we have you.
Yes, thank you, Ingrid. I hope you can hear me.
We can, yeah.
Yes, thank you. So it is a huge honor and a pleasure to be part of this truly global webinar. My presentation will touch upon Open Society Foundation's long-term experience and engagement with inclusion at the early childhood level, and then we'll actually talk more about the importance of inclusion for young children, and we'll end with a couple of thoughts about the role of teachers, so educators, the workforce in the ECD sector, and the role of civil society organizations in supporting educators to improve their practices in different parts of the world. Can I have a next slide, please? Thank you. Early Childhood Program of the Open Society Foundation has a long experience in prioritizing and supporting early years inclusion as a mechanism for promoting social cohesion and equity by addressing discrimination in communities and reducing the gaps in development amongst young children at risk of developmental delays and those belonging to vulnerable groups. All our work in inclusion field started in 1993 with our flagship step-by-step initiative, and actually moved on to be part of our global efforts to support the development of the early childhood education as a field, and also in terms of our commitment to supporting the development in policy and practices in select countries in different regions of the world. We do believe that support to ECD as a sector needs to include inclusion, definitely as a key principle of supporting young children as soon as they're born. But we also believe that the capacity of the field as a whole depends very much on the capacity of their institutions and mechanisms and networking capacities in different regions and globally, and also capacity of the donors and the global stakeholders to actually build a case for inclusion at the ECD level and to fund it. We believe that inclusion is important in an open and equitable society because it allows children at risk to realize their rights, get the best start in life, and become full and active members of their societies. We also think that the timely services prevent family separation and reduce socially and financially costly and harmful practices that are still present in many countries in the world, including in well-developed countries, which actually lead children to the life or in an institution or education in segregated settings. May I have the next slide, please?
Dragana? Can I ask you? Can I ask you to slow down a little bit for the Arabic translator? He's struggling to keep up with you. Thanks. Okay.
Thank you. So why inclusive early childhood development makes a difference? Inclusive ECD is comprehensive, multi-sectoral, integrated, child-centered, and play-based, and ensures that all children and their families are included. It also addresses children's developmental needs holistically. And because the child development is complex, children do need support from different sectors and interventions that support optimal nutrition, healthcare, responsive caregiving, protection, psychosocial support, and opportunities for early learning are all equally important. Early childhood development inclusive programs also promote values, attitudes, and behaviors, such as social justice and respect for all, and celebrate diversity and differences. And this is all very important to happen during children's formative years when these values are developing. They also address specific cultural context and different forms of inclusion at higher levels of education. So they are a pathway for actually a lifelong experience of inclusion instead of a lifelong experience of segregation for many children. It is especially important, it is especially important that quality early childhood inclusive programs provide support for the parents and caregivers, and they provide them with all necessary encouragement and skills so they are more confident in terms of supporting early development for their children. May I have the next slide, please? Why timely inclusion matters, why it's so important for the young children to be included in the type of services that I just explained. Early childhood is the most rapid phase in human development with critical opportunities for early stimulation. We now know much more than 10, 15 years ago about brain development. We know that years between a conception and the age 3 to 5 are critical for the brain development. And we also know that this is a huge opportunity for stimulation. And we know that if these opportunities are missed, they're going to be much more difficult actually to compensate for that. That puts a huge role on caregivers and parents, but also on all professionals and paraprofessionals who are getting in touch with young children from this very early age. To be most effective, inclusive education must begin in early childhood because inequalities in opportunities for learning and development also emerge as soon as children are born and lead to inequalities in outcomes. Also, evidence suggests that failure to recognize the right to inclusion from the early age is still very present. And despite that, there is evidence that by the time the children reach primary schools, achievement gaps are really, really difficult or nearly impossible to overcome and readdress. Investment in good quality and equitable ECD leads to better returns on investment than in any other level of education. And I will not go more into that because we just heard Nafisa's presentation, and we know that we still have unfortunate situation that key donors and governments are failing young children. Inclusive quality ECD helps compensate for the disadvantages at home. And so many young children are simply born in a situation when additional support will be needed from the day they were born. And ECD also compensates all the essential support that the communities need to prioritize this sector. May I have the next slide, please?
Nafisa, can we please ask you to slow down a little bit so our interpreter can catch up with you? Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So the next slide is the slide developed by the Nurturing Care Framework, a global initiative jointly developed between WHO, so World Health Organization, UNICEF, and the World Bank in 2018. This initiative builds on the cutting-edge research and findings from practice about early childhood development, and actually all this knowledge and experience has been actually addressed within this framework that is then put it forward and shared with the governments globally to support quality, equitable policies and practices in the world. This diagram suggests that young children need a different kind of support and different level, that actually all support starts with the family, so the inner circle, and that combination of nutrition and health and stimulation and safety and caregiving practices is crucial for the young children. And for this reason, caregivers' capacities and their capabilities need to be improved so they are confident and they can support their young children. And we do know that all parents need support, particularly when they are becoming parents for the first time, but we also know that some parents need all support they can get, and this particularly is important for the parents living in the situation of deprivation, and when they need additional support for helping their young children to develop and thrive. We also know that we need empowered communities. They actually do understand the reasons why early childhood development is important and it needs to be prioritized. But we need supportive services. They're fully available, fully equipped with the knowledge about the key principles about how young children developed. And also we need enabling policies, and the policies they are actually equally coming from different sectors who have some responsibilities for supporting young children. This is an interplay of interventions and different stakeholders' involvement, so we can actually be completely confident that young children can be prioritized and they will develop fully and thrive in life. May I have the next slide, please? The workforce, the role of the workforce can't be actually underestimated in this whole endeavor. We know that evidence suggests that the workforce is one of the most important factors influencing the quality of early childhood services. We know that the level of caregivers' education and participation in training is a better predictor of program quality than any other factors such as child staff ratio or group size. We also know there is a need for investment in the early childhood workforce so they can actually respond to these huge requirements. There is a lot of evidence, including the latest research shared as a result of the Global Monitoring Report 2020, which suggests that even 47% of countries surveyed about their capacity to implement inclusive education at all levels turned that they need enormous support in this sector, and even basic trainings related to a capacity to implement inclusive educations are missing in so many parts of the world. We know that what is, in terms of the content, what is really missing still in many countries, and this is also Open Society Foundation experience, is that issues that need addressing are definitely anti-discriminatory approaches, key principles of inclusion, knowledge about child development, knowledge about the key principles of early childhood intervention, but also knowledge about formative assessment, recording, assessing, and planning according to this formative assessment, knowledge about inclusive pedagogy, so ability really to transform what is available for majority of learners to all learners in the classroom. And of course, strategies actually for supporting collaboration and partnership between the sectors, strategies for bringing in specialists outside of the ECD sector who might be needed for some children, and definitely strategies for cooperating and coordinating between different educational levels, which is primarily important for supporting good quality transitions of young children. May I have the next slide, please?
Okay, just 1 or 2 minutes, Dragana.
That's fine. In the sector of ECD workforce capacity development, there are a variety of providers who deliver the training to different, and there are different types of training, some very short, some longer, and some trainings are available for majority of teachers in the country or the region. Some are much more difficult to be accessed, and for some teachers in the ECD workforce sector, there might be a specific entry requirements for actually accessing trainings, and in some cases teachers are required to pay for their trainings. This is leading to more inequalities in terms of accessing them, and also just the different kind of quality of trainings providing are actually bringing us up some additional implications. Also, trainings for those working with very young children in the 0 to 3 age group, auxiliary staff and staff lead working in rural parts of the countries are less available. So this is a huge concern. Also, in-service training opportunities are most effective when they are ongoing and when they are really meeting individual needs, and when they incorporate peer learning and an ongoing mentoring, which is not often the case. Rapid training of paraprofessional workers can be also effective, particularly in the countries when there is a shortage of staff fully trained to provide inclusive ECD. We do know that globally there is an insufficient number of staff in the ECD workforce. We know that their level of training is insufficient, and we know that they are definitely getting less attention in terms of their ongoing development once they're already in the working force. There are a lot of efforts globally to actually overcome this kind of major problems in supporting the workforce staff, and there is definitely a huge role for non-governmental training providers who are actually bridging the gap that exists in the sector, but really providing tailor-made trainings in different formats, primarily for those who are less likely to actually be covered by an ongoing support provided by the government or by other international players. This kind of provision is hugely important because it's definitely bridging the gap that exists. And I can't actually miss to say that EENET has been playing an enormously important role during the last 2 decades in supporting this field of early childhood inclusion trainings for inclusion in general, and then shifting their interest to providing capacity support to ECD inclusive workers. We know that EENET has some kind of unique skill to really develop the resources that are not only capturing the latest thinking in the field, but they're also really developed in the way they can be extremely useful, not only for grassroots practitioners in low and middle income countries, but also for service professionals. We have been fortunate to work with EENET during the last nearly 9 years, and we do believe that EENET's latest interest in supporting the ECD field in terms of different issues related to inclusion is going to continue, and we just believe this is a huge contribution to ECD as a field, and particularly to capacity development of ECD workforce. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much, Dragana. Again, if you have any questions for Dragana, please pop them in the Q&A box. And just to highlight, we're going to share all of the PowerPoint slides, and we're also going to try and translate as many as we can for our Arabic viewers. We'll get them translated and shared as well. So while my colleagues are just finishing checking the questions, I just wanted to quickly tell you a little bit about what we're going to do next, because obviously we've got these new videos that we've just launched today. And we've got our previous set of videos that Duncan and a couple of other people have mentioned called Inclusive Day. And our next step with our next 12 months of work is going to be to provide more advice and support on using these two video-based training resources. So we'll be developing a range of free online options to support trainers and to more effectively support them to use the video packages, and also support self-study among education personnel who can't attend training workshops, which at the moment is probably everybody. And as far as possible, we'll be making these available offline. We're also going to publish an edition this year of Enabling Education Review, which is our annual publication, and that's going to focus on early childhood development and education. So hopefully someone can post it in the chat box. We've got a call for articles, and we'd welcome any articles about your experiences. Now, before we go to the questions, we've got a quick poll for you, which I think hopefully Ayman can put up for us. When we're developing our new resources, we'd like to know, okay, so the question is, when EENET develops support for how to use the video-based trainings effectively, which format is your top priority? So would you like a large webinar like this one? Would you like small interactive webinars and meetings where everybody can engage? Is your priority an online self-study program or guidance, or self-study guidance that's available offline? And this is guidance for how you can make better use of the training videos in your work. So yeah, if you can vote for that before we come to the before we finish the Q&A. Now, let me see if I can find the Q&A questions. Have we got all our panelists on screen? Yes, we do. Let me just switch over the interpreter. Have I spotlighted you? No, have I done the wrong thing there? Okay. Okay, so if we've got all our panelists, Nafisa, do you want to go first with a question since you were first in the presentation? So the question is, how do you draw the attention from the parents of children with disability on early childhood development and education programs, as we know that it can be very helpful for children with disabilities? So how do you get their attention?
That's a really important question, and something that we as an organization are trying to do more and more of. I think it's so important, the messages about the value in the community that they highly value and trust. And that means that we also need to make doctors, nurses, other frontline workers, healthcare workers, social workers, and politicians need to be champions of early childhood development and share messages around this, and as well as religious leaders. So I think it's really important that that comes through. Secondly, I think seeing is believing. So we need to get children to join more quality, inclusive early childhood development education programs and their parents. And we must also track their progress and the parents' confidence in supporting them as well. And I think this evidence is really important moving forward to convince parents. Also with our like for the world, we've been doing a lot of, we started some training with community rehabilitation workers to help raise awareness among them about the importance of early childhood development. And also we're doing some radio shows, and soon we'll be releasing some animations that will be disseminated via WhatsApp and other social media in local languages to share what the importance of inclusive early child development. Now during the COVID time, what we've also done is made use of the opportunity and teamed up with Uhambo Foundation to develop a training module, online training module to train parents, caregivers, as well as community-based rehabilitation workers and health extension workers in inclusive early child development practices. And I think using WhatsApp and other innovative approaches. And I think that this is one, we do feel that there's a real need also that our frontline workers have a thorough understanding and start practicing it more. And I think just during this COVID pandemic, I can't emphasize how utmost important it is to promote an inclusive early childhood development, so we can help children and their families to overcome the challenges and mitigate any issues that they might have in later life.
Lovely. Thanks, Nafisa. I think that's all the questions we had for you. Duncan, we had a couple of practical ones and then some slightly longer ones. I know you've done some questions in the chat as well. This is probably a fairly quick one. How long did it take from start to finish to scope out and then get to the final product? You're muted. I'll unmute you. Unmute yourself, Duncan. You've got the sun in your eyes.
I'm trying to move around. So it took us about 18 months. I scoped in June, July in Ukraine and in Swaziland. And then we filmed in September and early October. And then it went into post-production where we were actually cutting, my colleagues, and finalizing this week. So I would say something like 18 months. But for the first film, the 10 films for an inclusive day, it took more like 2 years because there were 4 countries involved: Ukraine, UK, Myanmar, and Burkina Faso. So it took longer, takes longer the more countries we have.
And we would have been finished a bit quicker had we not had lockdown and all the challenges of educating kids at home and all kinds of things. Another question, what impressed you most during all the weeks of filming in different contexts? As you mentioned, there are some elements you could not record on the video, but did you and the team also capture elements you were not expecting or which surprised you?
I think myself, because I've worked for so long, I think 35 years or something in Africa now, from teaching and consulting. So and also being in Ukraine for a few years now, I'm not really surprised, but what really did impress me was the amount of teaching and learning aids, TLAs, that are created just using everyday materials, milk boxes, cartons, stones, sticks, and amazing. You'll see some of the footage especially in the ECD film, where learners are using very, very cheap, free materials, and teachers and workers and parents, guardians have made amazing things that they can play with, etc.
Okay. I think we can we share a list of the countries that were filmed? Okay, so this was Ukraine and Swaziland this time. And how did you get permission or consent from parents for the children you were filming?
So while I was away, I was digging out these. So these are our consent forms. So each year, and this goes back like 30 or more years, where I was working with Save the Children and going to different countries and that, you have to have consent forms. And we have different consent forms. We have consent forms basically for adults, just to say that they consent to having to be filmed, that their image and what they say will be used throughout the world. But also for younger learners, we have consent forms for parents, caregivers, for guardians, and also for the schools, because as a teacher, we are in locum parentis for the children when they are with us. So we get everybody to sign forms. The head teachers or administrators sign for the children that are in the school. when we do one-to-one filmings with parents and their children at home, etc., we have them, and we need to keep these. So they're translated. So these are translated into Ukrainian and Russian for Ukraine, and we keep them. They go off to the EENET office. I send them to Ingrid, and she's got all the different consent forms from all the years back, just in case somebody may come back and say, why did you use this image of me, or why did you use my child, or something else? We need to have this consent. So that's how we go about it. So these are our consent forms.
Okay, and I think we've got one more for you, Duncan, I think we've got a little bit of time. So one more. What are the main needs that are expressed by early childhood development workers that you've met? That's a tricky one.
There are many. I think it's needs that often throughout the education system people talk about, but it is resources, financial assistance, it is clarity from the ministries about what should be learned or delivered, or how should the ECDE settings be set up, etc., etc. There's still some confusion between the people who are working at the ground and the ministerial people as to what should and should not be happening in the ECD settings. So those are the sort of things. Parents as well, listening to parents, caregivers, guardians in their homes and that communities about saying we need more ECD provision. It's something that is just, for instance, in Ukraine, it's something that's it's been there for a long time. Other countries, it's just something that's new, but parents and guardians are all saying we need more of this. We would like to see this in every community. So that's why we went to Swaziland, because you can actually see the communities are actually assisting with these ECD basic rooms to get ECD provision started.
Okay, lovely. Well, we'll take you out of the spotlight, Duncan, and move on to Karen. There's a question for you, Karen. Do you consider schoolification to school readiness, or is it a part of school readiness? Not quite clear.
I understand that it's talking about, is school readiness considered schoolification, or is it a separate issue? And I guess the answer to that is, well, what does school readiness look like? If school readiness looks like school-like instruction taking place in early childhood settings, then it's schoolification. There's a bit of a movement towards rethinking the concept of school readiness, rather than looking for school readiness, children ready for schools, rather looking at schools making themselves ready for children. So when there's a disconnect between the way that schools look, how schools are like, and what early childhood settings are like, there's a bigger gap to bridge. But if we can make schools, and especially the early years of school, more familiar, more welcoming, more comfortable for children, and more age appropriate for them, the connection is smoother, the connection to school, but the transition from early childhood to school can be smoother. And I think that the onus shouldn't be on children to be ready. And inclusive education thinking, we welcome children with all of their diversity. We're not placing expectations on them to be a particular type of ready. So it makes a lot of sense in inclusive thinking for us to be looking to schools to be ready, rather than people call it a trickle down of school-like practices into early childhood with the well-meaning intention to help children to be more ready. But I think that we're promoting more of a push up of age-appropriate learning and teaching for children through into the early years of school. So I hope that answers the question.
Lovely, thanks Karen. Dragana, we have a question for you, or it's more of a statement actually, I'm not sure the question. In many low and middle income countries, is it not the case that much formal early childhood development and education is provided by the private rather than the public sector? So I don't know if you want to come back to that, whether it's...
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, that can be the case, and I think that actually raises a lot of issues around the importance of, again, coordination and cooperation between different providers of early childhood education. There are also issues around equitable access to different kind of provision, including provisions provided by private providers, and of course the issue of quality. In principle, the government should be able actually to coordinate the different kind of services providing on its territory, and should be a guarantee that actually the curriculum and quality of teaching and outcomes for children are monitored, and they are actually equitably provided for all children, because it is really important maybe to finish with all is all, and all means all children in inclusion, and that definitely applies to very young children. So this can actually a provision by private or civil society providers or state providers meets equally really to provide a good start of life for children, avoid any early segregation that can be actually a trajectory for life for so many children. So the issues of quality, equity, and outcomes for all children should be actually the key concern of the governments in terms of monitoring these provisions.
Sorry, I was just spotlighting interpreter. Okay, we have a couple more questions. I suppose I should take one. Someone's put a question for me. Can you elaborate on the effectiveness of documentaries and videos to bring about positive change? Oh gosh, that's a big answer. Maybe a cheating way of answering that would be to say that we have actually produced a little booklet that will accompany these videos, and it focuses on how to use the videos that we've got, the videos we've produced for advocacy purposes. So not just using them for directly training teachers, but how you could use them to bring about change in advocacy. So maybe that's a cheating answer, but have a look at that booklet, which will be on our website, hopefully by the end of the week. I think there was one more question appeared. Oh, hang on, it was in. Okay, question translated from Arabic. Is there I don't think this is for anybody in particular, so maybe anybody who wants to could chip in. Is there a clear policy to ensure that financial corruption is not involved with stakeholders and decision makers, and that the special needs of children's groups, especially in developing countries, are met? If that's one for Nafisa or Dragana, or if anybody can take that one. You're muted. Hang on, let's see if we can unmute you. There we go.
So the question was around making sure that there's no corruption. I think this is a challenge for the government. Sorry. Corruption is a challenge, and I think now during the COVID pandemic even more so. And this is why civil society plays such an important role in promoting and encouraging governments to be more transparent about the budgets they are allocating. And we are also encouraging that early childhood development, civil society networks at countries do a lot more strategic engagement with governments and track investments and funding towards early child development. And again, if you have parents who understand the value of it and inform them and make sure they're well informed about what services should be provided to them, they will then be empowered to demand those services. And in many cases, early child development services are at municipality level, So it is slightly easier to track progress, but for sure, these are just the challenges of our times. Corruption.
Lovely, thanks Nafisa. Dragana, you wanted to come in quickly and then we'll make this the last question. Hang on, you're on mute. You're muted, Dragana. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So I totally agree with Nafisa, and would just like to add that actually coordination between civil society, service providers, and the government, plus a donor community or whoever is actually in the country and willing and able to support equitable financing for early childhood inclusive education needs to work together. That means also different sectors of the ministry, but actually putting again a lot of emphasis on the capacity of civil society to engage, network, understand the issue, and then actively lobby for the change. And then when the change is happening, actively monitor whether the change is actually addressing the key issues is probably the most important thing. But even before going to that, I think that the key barrier to inclusion in education is probably the lack of belief that is possible and desirable. And I just think that we have to deal still with this situation before getting into financing mechanism, institutions, and collaborations.
Lovely, thanks Dragana. Okay, I think we'll wind up there because our hour and a half is up. We haven't managed to answer all the questions, but what we can try and do is get some written answers and perhaps share those. Iman can tell me whether we can do that or not, but share them with the with everybody who participated today. We'll try and answer everybody's questions. Just a quick reminder to go and have a look at our YouTube channel, our Facebook page, our Twitter page, our website, wherever is convenient for you. I think all the links have been shared in the chat, but we will share them again with everybody. And also our poll. So we asked when we're developing support for how to use the video-based trainings effectively, which format would be your top priority? A large webinar or a small interactive webinar or meeting, an online study program, or self-study guidance that's offline. And the winner was definitely small interactive webinars and meetings, followed by online self-study programs and guidance. So that's quite interesting actually, because and quite fortunate because it matches what we proposed in our funding bid. So I'm quite relieved by that. So that's probably where we're going to be putting our attentions for the next 12 months, although we probably will do some large webinars too. Okay, anything else I've forgotten? Anybody? No. Okay, so I'll say thank you to all our presenters, to Nafisa and Duncan and Karen and Dragana, and to everybody who's helped in the background today, and Arabic translation and our closed caption people and everyone who's monitoring the chats. Thank you very much.